Hi, my name's Nicola. I'm one of the founding directors of an organisation called Flourish Together. We're a social enterprise ourselves, and we're thrilled to have been asked by Sector 3 to come and help deliver some workshops and webinars as part of their ideas and inspiration sessions, helping people thinking through starting social enterprises. This is our first webinar series, and we're on session 3 now, where we're helping people to think through, what is social enterprise, refine ideas, and this session in particular is looking at governance before the final session looks at funding and funding bids. So welcome along, let's get started. And as I say, we've looked at who develops social ventures and why in part 1. We've looked at using this problem solving tool and a couple of tools in helping you strengthen and develop your ideas, part 2. Today and here now, we're going to look at legal structures and governance before the final session. So before we get into governance, legal structures and all this stuff, I just wanted to highlight different terms. People can get a bit muddled up. We don't help ourselves in the social enterprise world or social economy because there are so many phrases and it can get a bit mixed up. And from my point of view, having worked with social entrepreneurs and people setting up social enterprises for over 20 years now, they come in all shapes and sizes, they come across all sectors, and different types of people from different angles set these things up. So there's three terms here. None of these are legal terms, they're just names that people attach to things. So sometimes people might talk about community enterprises, where these are kinds of usually not for private profit organisations that operate in a particular community, locality, within a sort of their immediate impact is within a particular area or radius. Often they're linked to helping to regenerate communities. There are social enterprises that aren't, they might be linked to a particular community, but they aren't always. And they're providing all sorts of entrepreneurial solutions to social issues. And then there are more creative ones, lots of creative entrepreneurs, particularly those that might be working in heritage or supporting people to develop creative skills, might sit within the not-for-private profit space. Don't get me wrong, there's a huge creative and digital industries world out there that's very private sector driven. But I'm just highlighting and recognizing that if you're coming to the table as a sort of creative entrepreneur, there's a good chance there's space for you in the sort of social enterprise world as well. So this slide really just highlights some of the differences and some of the organisations that you might want to go to for support. So community enterprises, as I've said, they're often very place-based. They're often the people that own them are immediate sort of residents or people that are direct beneficiaries of the organisation there. As I say, they might be seeking to regenerate assets. There's lots of examples of sort of community pubs, laundrettes, community centres, and even sort of community enterprises that are hairdressers now. There's various not-for-private profit organisations they're making a profit and they've got an enterprising solution to a social issue, but once they start turning a profit, they're reinvesting that back into addressing local needs, particularly in a community enterprise. And yeah, the money will go back into the community. In terms of who might support these things, Power to Change, the Plunkett Foundation and Locality are 3 agencies, national agencies, that understand the world of community enterprise and are researching it, supporting it, and can link you to networks of people who are doing that stuff. And so something to bear in mind. Some of the other agencies that we mentioned here will also support community enterprise, but those are ones particularly well known for it. Social enterprise, and back in session 2, we talked about the whole context and landscape of social enterprise and the numbers of these things that are out there and the sectors that they work across. But ultimately, creating entrepreneurial solutions to social issues. They're sometimes community-led, but sometimes they're more thematic. So often they'll want to have a board or governance that's representative of the people that they're supporting, that's inclusive, and just depending on where they're based, what they're doing and how they work, will dictate whether they're community led in a way like a community enterprise would be, or given that some are around national organisations or working across a larger area, and might be working across health or well-being, criminal justice, education, the environment. They'll have representatives and people that perhaps represent those communities rather than a physical locality, if that makes sense. They'll reinvest their profits in social purpose and community benefit. And organisations out there who help people perhaps at the earlier stages of this stuff are Unlimited, Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs. There's Social Investment Business, who support more from a kind of loan and larger scale investment point, but worth hearing about. And the School for Social Entrepreneurs also help people at those earlier stages and run a whole range of sort of cohort-led courses to support people. And there is one in the Northwest, based out of Liverpool, but they work across the Northwest. The creative enterprises I mentioned a minute ago, it's just bringing you into the fold, really. If you're a creative artist, musician, creative writer, maybe you're doing creative work to improve health and well-being, or you're working with older people to use creativity in the arts to support with keeping people's skills and keeping people's social circles for longer. There are many people working in this social economy and social enterprise space that have a foot in the creative camp, and it's just realizing that often people will use creativity and culture to build sustainable and resilient communities in lots of different ways. Creative entrepreneurs, sometimes they're suitable as a social enterprise or a community business. Sometimes they're more sort of independent freelancers that just happen to be doing good, and so it's a little bit more of a grey area depending on whether you're working as an individual and what your sort of overall purpose is going to be longer term. But as I say, there's lots of social enterprises that have creative aspects to what they're doing, and organisations that help people at an early stage might be some that I mentioned here, the Arts Council, Nesta, British Council, and others are out there to help people, and those organisations have all sorts of other things. But if you're at that early stage in your journey thinking which agencies might help me, these are some to go to. So and look up and Google and see if you're eligible for some of their program support, or you can learn from toolkits that they'll have online to help startups or scale ups. So have a look at that. I set that context initially because legal structures, people can get bogged down in if they're not careful. And, really what I've been always trying to do is try and bring legal structures to life for people. It's all about helping you develop projects and organisations that can govern yourselves well. I think we had these images, some of these images here are of social enterprises that we talked about earlier in the series, different creative arts and wellbeing organisations, people helping people with food and nutrition, textile development. We've talked about all sorts, but the bottom line is they all have to have as you grow, once you get past the idea stage, you have to have a structure in place to help you manage what you're doing, create that real change and tackle those social problems that you're trying to tackle, to not go it alone and get that team built up. But also funders won't fund you unless you form yourself into an entity. There was some early stage stuff, but in the main, once you've been going a little while, most projects turn into an organisation, and that might have a company structure, it might not. And we're just going to walk through some of those things. Could be just to give you a heads up or to help you reflect on what you've developed and is it the right fit, and how can you make your governance and your board work best for you. So if you're at the early stages of setting something up and you're thinking, what should I be? What should, is now the right time? Some of these questions are things to ask yourself to help you make some good decisions, really. Often with legal structures, the things it comes down to is, who's going to own this? this organisation? Who's it for? Who do you foresee running it now, and who might run it in the future? This just helps you to work out, whether to incorporate or not, whether you're setting up as a private entity, as a sole trader, as a freelancer. Are you a one-man band and you're going to stay a one-man band and that's how it's going to be? Or are you thinking about, in order to create the changes you need, are you going to have to build a team quite quickly, or that you can't do it alone, so you're wanting to kind of evolve a group, or you're wanting this to be a really sort of community-led initiative, so you're going to need to evolve this group. So thinking about that is quite key. Thinking about how you're going to generate income and get resources to start up or scale up. No funder, there are bits of money out there for sole traders, or for certain industries or sector once you're at scale, but in the not-for-private profit world, funders won't fund you unless you've got a minimum of 3 non-related directors or 3 non-related committee members around a constituted group. And so thinking about, where's money going to come from, how are you going to generate it, and what might happen to profits and surpluses, and thinking about what tax implications you might have might dictate what you want to be. There are a handful of elements of tax relief for charities, for example. So if you're taking on buildings or assets, and you want to benefit from some 80% rate relief and these sorts of things, thinking those things through at the start can help you. Quite often, lots of social enterprises aren't going to take on their own assets, and they're running, I don't know, might be running training workshops, or they might be running events, or they might be creating toolkits or doing consultancy, and so that kind of rate relief thing doesn't come into play. But taking the time to think through where are you at now and what might you want to do in the future will help you work out what side of the spectrum you might want to be on, and how much red tape you're prepared to deal with. Also, the market and the community. So thinking about tax, and not tax, but more, the income generation aspect we were just talking about. Have your community got the resources to pay for your products and services? What often will happen, social enterprises will often go into areas where there aren't amenities, or perhaps there are high levels of poverty and hardship, and opening the doors to some shop or some service, the immediate community might not have the want, the need, or the cash to pay for that stuff, whatever it might be. And so thinking up how you're going to make a business model out of this, and using a social enterprise model might be the best way, or the only way, to get activities, amenities and services happening that are going to benefit people. And so thinking about, is there money in the community that you're going to, and how are you going to make that work? Thinking about to what extent you want the community to have a role in developing the shape of your organisation. If you're supporting people with lived experience in a particular way, then clearly that's going to be quite important. If you're actually keeping that to one side and are selling flip-flops for a living, then you've got quite a different approach to your marketing in your market. So and I say that because there are a number of social enterprise flip-flop sellers out there, so I don't say that flippantly, but it's just having a think, who are your community? Have they got a vested interest in shaping and wanting to be part of it? And do you need to demonstrate that for funders in future? Or, there's some other angle on this. There's also how you want to be perceived by the public. I've worked with lots of people over the years that they don't want to be viewed or seen as a charity case or a charity, and they're adamant that they want to set up as a social enterprise. And on the flip side, I've seen others where they've wanted to make sure that this is a really sort of cooperative, community-led, community-owned organisation. So thinking about how your public or your community are going to trust what you're doing and build legitimacy in what you're doing, and keep that positive public perception and relationship are all factors to think about when you're thinking about legal structure. And I don't say all this to sort of overcomplicate it. You know, it's a quick yes no answer to some of this stuff, and you can sort of refine down what options are going to work for you. So in terms of the options, I've just got this slide here that helps give a bit of a spectrum of some of the options. There are other options. This is just giving the general rules of thumb on this. So on the one hand, where you've got CLG, company limited by guarantee, with charitable status. So this is the more philanthropic end of the spectrum, right through to the sort of private structures, including sole traders. So you've got the sort of charity and philanthropic on one end, and the kind of private structures on the other. And quite often what you choose to do, or how you choose to develop your legal structure, really does affect funder and investor preferences and who you'll be able to go to in the future for certain types of money. And so just bearing this in mind is worth doing at the start, and it's worth recognizing as you evolve. And you know, this isn't such a set in stone. This is just giving you a bit of a guide here. So more often than not, those on the more charitable end, so the company limited by guarantee with charitable status, a company limited by guarantee with community interest company status with more sort of philanthropic needs and goals, an unincorporated association, which is more of a community group, a constituted group, you might have heard of those terms, or a BENCOM, which is a society for the benefit of the community, which is more a charitable version of a co-op. These can all fundraise in various ways. They might be able to access crowd financing, as various others. They can access commission contracts and other types of philanthropic, I'm calling them loans or grant, the social investment basically, that's perhaps a grant loan mix, and there are just obviously various options that are open to these organisations, as well as social investor loans to a point, as long as they can pay those loans back. So there are various routes to resources, in addition to trading and commissioning, that those on the more philanthropic end of the spectrum can go for. And registered charities have a much broader range of charitable trusts that they can approach than you know, other types of company limited by guarantee might be able to go for. So it's just thinking that through and thinking what feels best for our community, what feels right for us, and actually, are we going to need to trade? Are we going to need to do these other things, or are we looking at needing to go for quite a regular approach to funding options for the work that we're needing to do? And in the current climate, it's highly competitive, and it always has been, if I'm honest, but it's become more so in recent years. So not being reliant on that is going to be key. In the middle ground here, we've got just standard company limited by guarantee. There are private companies limited by guarantee, but in the social enterprise world, it's usually a not-for-private profit memorandum and articles of association that you have, and your aims will be charitable in nature, and the way you wrap up your organisation, the dissolution clause will state that any surplus resources will remain for the benefit of the community. So it's not physically asset locked in there as it is with a community interest company, but you can still write a governing document that says pretty much the same. So there's that version. There's a community interest company memorandum and articles of association that are out there. And as I say, the difference being that asset lock is written in, and you choose who you would have your assets go to should you wind up as you incorporate your organisation. Different types of co-ops, again, will sit in that middle ground, because they're trading, they're accessing funding and operating in particular ways. And charitable incorporated organisations are also within that mix, because although they're charitable and they're philanthropic, there's been a slight shift. Rather than a company limited by guarantee with charitable status, the new model, the CIO, does allow a little bit of flexibility where directors can be remunerated slightly more than they can be in company limited by guarantee charity currently. I think there is a shift to just have the CAO, and that's what they're kind of working towards. But typically, charity directors can't be paid, is the rule. Social enterprise directors that are community interest companies can be paid, and within a CIO, there's this slight, call it a hybrid version, but directors of a CIO can receive slightly more financial remuneration over and above expenses than a traditional charity would have been able to. So I peeled it out, that's why that's in the middle. And then we hit the sort of private structure side, as I say, sole traders and people setting up private businesses. And I mention them here, some people might take a sharp intake of breath, but quite often if you're setting up an idea, you're trying to change the world, if all you know is to try and make some money to make this thing work, but you know you want to make a difference, and you don't want to get bogged down in all of these other structures, and you're trading, but you might want to be a social enterprise in future, you're not sure yet, being a sole trader is your only option. So often somebody might start as a sole trader, and then once they've got their products and services evolved, once they've built a sense of who their community is, and they've kind of had time to think about things, they may then evolve into a kick or a charity or a co-op or whatever else. So that's why the sole traders are on here. There's a company limited by shares, with or without kick status, and cooperatives again are on there. There is one that's not on here called a limited liability partnership, and that again is something that some people would choose to develop, but there are various routes, as you can see, to setting up some sort of structure and getting some time to think things through. Ask yourself all of these questions, speak to people like me, people like Sector 3 and others who've been there and done it, and you'll be able to whittle it out and think what's best for you. And at least having a glance at a slide like this will give you a feel for where types of income and resource might be able to flow from, depending on the structure that you're setting up. So just to kind of recap on what these things are and the paperwork. So starting with the unincorporated forms, basically there's an unincorporated association is usually where I often tell people to start. If they're not sure where their business model is yet, they're not really clear on how it's all going to work, but they know they're trying to make a difference, they've got an idea, and they could do with applying for some funding to test their idea out, because there's no other means of doing that, or there's clear social benefits around what it is they're trying to do. Setting up a constituted group with a constitution, unincorporated association is often by far and away the simplest, most cost-effective ways of getting started. There is, you do have to be careful, because you've got to be appropriately insured. You've got to know who you're setting up your group with so that you're going to work well together, and so on. But often, as it says here, it can often be a really good place to sort of road test what you're doing, work out who you might want your directors to be in future, and having that constituted group as a test bed for a year or so in order to then evolve into a company with directors. And we often encourage people to think about that. There are charitable trusts that are incorporated as exempt charities, and that's something to think about. And as I say, a sole trader, they are also unincorporated, and so they're basically not incorporated with one of the key bodies out there. And there's different ways that people can go about getting started when they're unincorporated in that way. Constitution for your association, and with a sole trader, you'd end up getting in touch with the Inland Revenue. They give you a unique tax reference number, and you just get going. A funder will not fund a sole trader, though. A, because you're a one-man band, and B, because it's seen as a private entity. So it's just something to bear in mind. Incorporated, we've got a list here. So various types of companies. The companies limited by guarantee that might have charity status with the Charities Commission. They might have KIC status with the KIC regulator, or they might just be, standard company limited by guarantee, registered with Companies House, operating as on a sort of profit for purpose kind of model. But company limited by guarantee is usually a fairly straightforward way of getting moving when you're ready to have that company set up. So when you know who you are, who you definitely want your directors to be, that you've got the time to fill in the paperwork and do the annual returns and make sure that your company accounts can be sent off to Companies House. And or the Charity Commissioner or the KIC regulator, one of the things that I'll often say to people is, company accounts cost 750 quid and upwards to put together. Small group accounts or sole trader accounts are often more like 150 to 250 pounds. So you might choose to look after your own financial stuff, but in the main, that's usually best done by the professionals, particularly if you're applying for all sorts of different funds, and particularly if producing income and expenditure and tracking all of that and producing accounts isn't your thing. There are brilliant accountants out there who can help with that, but there is a price difference, and often that's quickly dictates which setup you want to be. So there's also companies limited by shares with KIC status or just as they are, as incorporated, and charitable incorporated organisations, not associations, all sit under the incorporated set of typical types of company that people will, or types of organisation that social enterprises might develop. They have this thing called a memorandum and articles of association, and it's a standard template document. It has your kind of aims and objects and a whole, 20 pages of how you govern what you do. In comparison, a constitution is about 3 sides of A4. That's quite simplistic. It's got your aims and your objects and what will happen to your resources should you wind up and how you're going to run. But the 2 things that give you a sense of who's this organisation, how are they operating, how are they making decisions and managing meetings, and what happens to any surplus resources if they wind up. That's the crux of what these things often are. Sometimes they'll talk about to what extent you're engaging certain members of your community or the public, but the documents are quite different in terms of length and in terms of language. And having a look at those will help you work out, does this feel like the right stage? Does this feel like the right type of organisation for us? And you can get support, as I say, from me, colleagues of mine. I know lots of people that help people sort out the governance, or your local council for voluntary services. And for example, Sector 3 in Stockport is the one that you would link to. Just last but not least, I didn't want to leave co-ops out, because co-ops are a model that people may well want to go for. There are BENCOM, so societies for the benefit of the community. There are standard co-ops regulated by the FSA that are non-charitable but are still a sort of social ethical model. And there is also something called a workers co-op. These different types of co-ops are regulated by different groups, and there's a document that they have called rules. It can cost a little bit more to set up a co-op with the rules than it does to set up a company, which costs about 35 quid plus any support needs that you might have. To set up a co-op, it's more like a few hundred from a standing start, and it's just working through which route and which style feels right for you. As I've mentioned, really, in order to be able to apply for any funding, you need a minimum of 3 non-related directors. You can have family members in your thing, in your project, organisation and company, but you would need to make sure that there were, if there's you and your sister or you and your partner or whoever it is, that there's at least another 2 non-related directors or committee members as part, or trustees as part of your group. So just wanted to give you that as the terminology when you're ready for it, to be able to talk to people in a way and think things through. However, and this is the most important thing, you are more than your legal structure, obviously. It's a facet and it's an aspect. Just like at the start, we've been talking about who are these people and the characteristics and attributes in part 1. And then we were talking about, thinking about solving problems and thinking about coming up with the best solutions. Legal structures is another aspect to think about eventually when you've evolved your ideas and you're starting to put some organizational and sort of governance around what you're doing. But clearly there are multiple other critical success factors that makes what you're doing work, and highlighted here, the people involved. So your team that you might evolve, whether that's staff, whether that's supporters, whether that's volunteers, wider stakeholders. So that's anybody who's got a vested interest in what you're doing. And that will include customers and beneficiaries. And we mention those separately because your customers of a social enterprise or charity may be different to your beneficiaries. As I've mentioned in across these sessions, often social enterprises will be setting up in areas where people can't traditionally afford to pay for those services or things. Not all do. Some are selling products and services directly to the public or directly to business, and they're using those profits to reinvest in a community of interest. That might be, I don't know, ex-offenders, young people, women affected by domestic abuse, and they're off selling something to bring home the money to do, Robin Hood effect, to invest in something for the beneficiaries. But quite often, if you're setting up services for particular groups that can't afford to pay for it, you have to find the customers elsewhere. People might donate something, they might pay a subsidized price or whatever, or they might be accessing it free at the point of delivery, at the point of access, but it's somebody else who's paying for that service, be it a funder, a commissioner like your council or a housing association, or a sponsor, a corporate sponsor. So the people behind the scenes are clearly key to what's going on. The proposition, so by that we're meaning what it is you're offering. What's the solution? What's your social value proposition? What you're creating and why? And how is it tackling a social issue in a sustainable way? And you will, articulate that through your kind of vision and value and mission, and put that out there. It's very important to kind of get that clear, and it takes a little while actually to really nail that sometimes. The resources are often very important. They're key to what's going to be happening. So whether they're capital resources, equipment and assets or other things, buildings and so on, or overheads, light, heat, insurance, the ongoing costs of what you're doing, marketing and PR, even at startup, there's an element of communication that you've got to do, whether you're doing it kind of bootstrapped, in your own way, or paying somebody else to help with that. It's a resource need that evolves and grows as you grow. And clearly people and services, be that professional services or other delivery costs, are going to be key as the resources that you'll need to find to make things happen. And performance and measuring the performance of what you're doing is key in a social enterprise, as I mentioned right in session 1. Where social enterprises will often, not only they're reporting on what they're doing, planning and reporting on whether things are getting delivered and done, financial reporting and so on, they're often doing social value measurement and social impact measurement to understand the ripple effect of what it is that they're doing, to build that track record and that evidence base, and to better pitch their services or pitch their ideas for what they need to be commissioned or to be funded in order to secure funds and contracts and anything else. So performance and measuring performance in different ways is key. And the plan, we're going to talk about business planning in part 2, the second series of our webinars, but the plan is usually, it's a culmination of various things. There's various plans and various documents, as we'll talk about in the series 2, webinar series 2. What I would say is 2 things. on plans. You know, there's always got to be a working document, and it's got to be something you can use and something that makes sense to you. Putting together business plans that, you know, are obsolete after you've written them, or that don't make sense or can't be reviewed and revised quickly, a bit of a pointless exercise. So thinking about how you're putting together information to communicate to different audiences is really what your plan's all about. And the second thing I would say is doing a plan. It's very easy to start with a waffle, start with the story, start with a nice, you know, stories of what you're going to do and how it's all going to work and what you know, what you think you're doing. But the bottom line is people can waffle an awful lot of a business plan and never ever make it to the finances. You know, 5, 6, 12 months down the line, they're still not really worked out where's the money coming from and what's the financial story of how this is all going to work. So I would encourage people to always start with the figures, even if it's just packet, you know, nuts and bolts of what income and expenditure might look like, or thinking about some scenarios of if we got this number of workshops delivered a month, or this number of events, or these many flip-flops, as I mentioned earlier, or these many items sold, what would that generate? What would that do for us? Is it going to be viable? Is where I would encourage you to start. And these are all, you know, things to think about, aren't they? So I hope I've not put people off. You know, you just here with an idea, you're here with some motivation to want to develop something, but as you'll come to see, there's a lot more to it than that. Things do snowball, and what I will say is you don't have to go it alone, basically, and you deal with this in bite-sized chunks, so it doesn't get overwhelming, hopefully. So just while we're talking about governance and while we're talking about legal structures, coming up with who you might want to have in your group to get started, or whether or not you're on your own or you're within a group, thinking about what your legal structure might want to be over time, and thinking about the other plans and the other planning. Those critical success factors are really important. But once you've got this group of people together as an organisation or as a team or whatever you want to call yourselves, it's just having a think about how you're actually going to govern yourselves, how you're going to operate. So, you know, who are the people around the table, what kinds of processes or policies and procedures, or how frequently might you need to meet, and, you know, what are the logistics around you meeting as a team or a group or a board, and who's going to be responsible for what, basically. Thinking about these roles, you've got your directors or your committee members, the trustees, the people around the table who are sort of thinking through how this organisation is going to work and what it's going to do. And some of you might be executive directors, or, you know, more hands-on with, you know, trustees or committee members. There's the doers, and then there's the people who sort of support strategically and champion around the edges. And so there's a role for both of these in your organisation, and an executive director does the doing, and a non-executive director often is a champion, a support, or a sounding board, or might be influencing in a particular way, or have responsibility for something specific, but isn't really involved in the day-to-day of what you're doing. And the same goes for other types of structure that you might adopt, people who do and people who support. And so thinking about who's who, what's their role in this, and having clarity of communication around that is always really key. And often some of those people involved might be more of a support to the founder or the person developing it. They might be involved more in promotion and connection building, or they might be bringing specialist knowledge. And so when you're thinking about, you know, gosh, if I want to apply for funding and I need 2 non-related directors, you know, who would you have? Or 2 non-related committee members, who would you invite onto this thing? It might be local leader or community member. It might be a former colleague or former boss, or somebody that you've known for a long time who you've got trust built with. So having a real think about who would make the best people to have on your board, and often this changes. Who you have on your board or your committee at the start is different. 3 to 5 years on, people step down, new people come on, and having a think through, what skills and support do you need? What skills and knowledge needs to be around the table to get this thing moving or to get this thing started is quite key. And that can be revised and reviewed as you evolve and as you grow. So you don't, you go with your wish list at the start and see who you can have come join you. There are other groups as well who just need, what you want to do, what you want to deliver, you just need to get started. And so having a couple of people there as more of a sounding board to you, but just leave you to get on with it initially, can be another sort of version, another way of getting going. But what you'll find is over time that you do need more support and more involvement from your committee or your board. And so having the right people on board in the first place is a really big, it's important to try and do. I've worked with lots of people who relationships broke down or communication didn't work, or they hadn't realised that, having, lots of people on board who were perhaps benefiting from what they were doing, but hadn't got sort of the strategic clout to make it grow, could perhaps hamper the growth of what you're trying to develop. So thinking things through, getting some advice, getting some support from people can really help you make the best decisions and think about, how are you going to work best and most effectively. You really don't need to rush this, but there'll be some pressures. It'll be, you need some help, or you want to apply for funding, or, you want to be seen as an organisation or an entity, and these sorts of things start to kick in and make you take your governance more seriously. But as I say, considering not just now, but your future support needs will help you make the best decisions and get the right people on board in the first place. So that takes us to the end of this session and this series of webinars. So we've had 4 sessions as part of this first webinar series. I hope you found them insightful and of use. I'm sorry if you're bored of the sound of my voice, but I'm contactable on michaela@flourishtogether.org.uk or my other Twitter handles there. You can come to some of our Flourish events. They'd be very welcome to look those up and meet us at virtual or physical stuff. And obviously Sector 3, who's commissioned these webinars to take place, are a great source of information, both by their website, through various a great sort of funding resource that they have on their website, and also through the staff team there as well, who you can contact through the website. So been great to kick this webinar series off. We'll be back with the second set of webinars all about business planning and the business model canvas and these sorts of tools shortly. So do look out for those and get in touch if you need any additional help.